Um, so thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Ellen O'Keefe. I am the director of the Glen Rock Library. Uh, just a little information. You folks know the governor has said, Governor Murphy has indicated that we are going to be moving to phase two, stage two or phase two. You think I know the acronyms and all the terminology by now. The library and museums expect to open in the next stage. We don't have a date for that stage yet, but do understand and I hope you folks, we appreciate your patience. We are working on the proper methodology and steps to safely reopen the library. So stay tuned for that because we're just as anxious to get you guys using our services in our more traditional ways. Today we have the pleasure of having Evan Weiner talk with us about 1970, a watershed moment in American history. Today's program is generously sponsored by the Friends of the Library, and Evan is also giving us permission to record it. So anyone else interested in sharing the material, we'll have that opportunity for you. So during the presentation, we're going to turn off attendee microphones. I will monitor the chat, and then Evan is also going to give us an opportunity to open it back up again to share more about perhaps your own personal experiences with this very rough year. So please take it away, Evan.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Glen Rock Library, the patrons, and also some of my friends who have decided to see 1970. And one bookkeeping thing here, I don't mind if you want to talk as I'm going, just I guess raise your hand. I don't know how you're going to handle that, or something in chat if you have something to add. And a lot of the people, I've done this talk quite a few times, a lot of people do have a lot to add about 1970. Some raw emotions do come out. My background is as a journalist. I started in 1971. I was 15 at Spring Valley High School, show called Tiger Talk on WRKL radio. Joe Dionisio was the 11th grade English teacher who put me into this business, saying you have a good voice. The other thing Joe did was open the door for me to work at the Journal News in Nyack, New York, and the Borg Hackensack Bergen Record as well, and I had 3 stints at the Bergen Record. 1970, I was 13 and 14 years old, and I lived in Muncie, New York. In Rockland County, and I seem to remember every Saturday there was a protest in the middle of the street, literally in Nanuet, New York, right across the street from the Holiday Inn, right off the thruway, exit 14 exit. And people would stand there, didn't matter what the weather was, and the thing was, they wanted to get out of Vietnam. If you look at the history of all of this, this thing goes back to 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And it expands in 1967. It's ramped up in 67. Lyndon Johnson's the president. Johnson allegedly decides not to run again because he saw Walter Cronkite in 1968's report on Vietnam, and allegedly he said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country. Richard Nixon comes in 1969. He too is going to end the war. But the war keeps going and going and going, and there's all kind of racial strife as well going on in the United States, and things are going around the world, also going on around the world. That is Marianne Vecchio. She's 14 years old. She's a runaway from Florida who somehow ends up at Kent State University, and she's screaming, that is a dead body. Killed by somebody from the Ohio National Guard. It happens on May 4th. 1970, but obviously this has been building up since the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which took place in 1964. That's Seattle. That is a protest march shutting down what is now I-5 in Seattle. It doesn't look like that anymore because my daughter actually lives in the upper right-hand corner of that picture. And here you got police, the guard, and there you got protesters, and this is not unusual. There was a lot of protesting, and normally here at this part of the talk, when I'm in person with anybody or in person with people, I ask the question, were you an anti-war protester or were you not an anti-war protester? And if you have stories, I'm not going to ask you right now. I'm going to hold it to the end because we're limited with Zoom. Talking about your experiences as either an anti-war protester or somebody who was taking the side of the soldiers and the Nixon administration and the war. And there is Nixon. Oh, there he is. I got to know Nixon in 1985. He comes back after he is the arbitrator, Major League Baseball owners and the Major League Umpires Association, and he's the guy who hammers out an agreement, and he becomes proper again in society in 1985. He's a senior statesman because of that. Where you see Nixon here, this is early May of 1970, very, very early on a Saturday morning before a major protest, and he goes out and decides he's going to talk to the protesters because all hell has broken loose. Of course, Vietnam, there are the soldiers. They're still in Vietnam at this point. The calendar flipped to 1970, the problems from the so-called Summer of Love, 1967, Vietnam, race relations don't disappear. From 1968, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, basically Lyndon Johnson resigning, saying he's not running again, the Democratic National Convention, they're all still there. A whole bunch of things that happened in 1969, including moratoriums, big protests, they don't disappear. And in 1969, you had the beginning of the silent majority in November of 1969. The Vietnam War is still raging, but one war comes to an end, and it's a forgotten war. It's the Biafran War. The Middle East remains a powder keg. In fact, 1970, it would erupt again. The Cold War. Well, the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States may have been won going to the moon in 1969, but the Cold War continued. And of course, racial divisions remain in America. You might have seen that poster back in 1968, 69, 70. If you watch TV, particularly late night TV, and I did watch late night TV despite my tender age of 12, and you might remember care commercials and the Biafran kids, and send whatever money you can to Biafra, and we'll feed the starving kids. This is a war that started in 1967. Biafra was part of Nigeria, the southern part of Nigeria. They wanted their own country, and they decided to go to war. The Nigerian Civil War, the Biafra War, started on July 6, 1967. It ends on January 15, 1970. Biafra represented nationalist aspirations of the Biafran people. The Biafrans felt that they could not coexist anymore with the northern-dominated federal government. Biafra was basically fighting an uphill battle here because the Nigerians got support from the UK in this war. By 1968, the Nigerian troops surrounded the coastal oil city, Port Harcourt, and there was a blockade, which led to mass starvation during 2.5 years of war. Maybe about 100,000 casualties, and somewhere between 500,000, 2 million Biafrans died, civilians, of starvation. That is the short-lived Biafran flag. There's still some pockets today in Biafra or that area that would like to have their own country, but it's pretty much simmered down over the last 50 years. It was a 2.5-year war, and the blockade was by Nigerian troops with help from the British government. The Biafrans would eventually surrender to the Nigerian federal military government. The United States sat on the sidelines here. Nuclear proliferation, that is a nuclear proliferation treaty that was signed in March, and the purpose of that treaty was to prevent the further spread and creation of nuclear weapons, work to disarmament, and for nations to work with one another in the safe development and the use of nuclear energy. It's relatively quiet in the United States. Lots of weekend demonstrations, also demonstrations in other areas, in Canada and in England, as I've learned over the years giving these talks from 67 to 71 or so. because of these guys, the Vietnamese in Vietnam, the Americans fighting the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong. Now, I'm sure a lot of you remember in 1970, if you're old enough, that every day you used to flip on the news. And I, as a 12 or 13-year-old, would listen to News Radio 88 New York, WCBS radio. And the first thing you would hear, Casualties at Dawn, which George Harrison put in a 1987 song, When We Were Fab. Casualties at Dawn, how many Viet Cong killed, how many wounded, Americans killed, Americans wounded, Allies killed, Allies wounded, the body count. And the protests, which ended in '69 of, hey, LBJ, how many kids you killed today? He's gone, but it continues and the war continues. August 7th, 1964, Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that allowed Lyndon Johnson to take any necessary measure to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States to prevent the further aggression by the communist government of North Vietnam. There was that old domino theory that if South Vietnam fell, then Laos would fall, and Cambodia would fall, and Thailand would fall. The domino theory, everybody in Southeast Asia would become communist, joining China or the Soviet Union at that point. Did the Gulf of Tonkin resolution or Gulf of Tonkin incident take place? It was an alleged attack on 2 U.S. naval destroyers off of Vietnam, the coast of Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin effectively launched America's full-scale involvement into the Vietnamese War. Now, or that was a civil war, I should say, which it was, a civil war. We got to go back to November of '69. Technically, it's not 1970, but it's close enough. The great silent majority, Richard M. Nixon. This happens on November 3rd, 1969, a televised speech. And so tonight, to the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. The support? Well, the support was for Vietnam, and the Nixon official majority was a large and never demonstrated cross-section of the country that until last night, November 3rd, 1969, refrained from articulating its opinions on the war. Nixon referred to the vast majority of Americans who didn't take place in the mass demonstrations, and the mass demonstration in Washington was still to come after his silent majority speech against the Vietnam War and participate in the counterculture. I've always asked people, maybe somebody there can tell me, what was the counterculture? I think my picture is frozen. Have I frozen or am I okay? Because I know my picture is frozen right now. But if I'm okay, I'll keep going. The public discourse in the country as well. Those were not only people from the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw would call them, people from World War II, the veterans, who were at that point 55, 56, 57 years old, but also people from the West, the Midwest, the South, many of whom would serve in Vietnam. And let me see on the chat here. Okay. I would assign it to my students to watch. That was the Walter Cronkite show. I'm frozen here, so my picture is frozen. I'm going. And there is Carl and Ferry McIntyre. Carl and Ferry McIntyre, the Reverend Carl McIntyre, and he has a big pro-Vietnam War demonstration. Prayer and Bible support the troops in Vietnam. So you have a counter-revolution or counter-demonstration to what was going on at the time in Washington. That was April 4th of 1970. With Bible in hand, the Reverend Carl McIntyre and his wife Ferry led the March for Victory, Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, April 4th, 1970. That was the second anniversary, by the way, of the killing of Martin Luther King. McIntyre said his parade was a demonstration for military victory in Vietnam. That was Lester Maddox. Lester Maddox became the governor of Georgia. He was a segregationist. He had a chicken restaurant in Atlanta, Georgia, would eventually become the governor. Here he is talking to the assembled crowd in front of the Washington Monument. Not too many people compared to the 2 million people that showed up on November 15th, 1969 for the moratorium. Maddox left you no doubt he was a segregationist, and he said, just in case some of you communist, socialists, or other integrationists have any doubt, his restaurant, the Pickrick, will never be integrated. If you want some fried chicken, it will have to be something other than the Pickrick. Now, All in the Family starts in 1971, January of 1971. But Norman Lear has the show sold to CBS. It's going to come on as a mid-season replacement in January of 1971. So all of the writing for that particular show, is taking place in 1971. And, or 1970 for 1971. And Archie Bunker is the kind of guy that would be part of the silent majority. And I do a lot more with Archie in 1971 when the show gets on. But the Archie Bunker character is based on what Nixon's people talked about. Many Americans, particularly the working class, middle class whites, responded to the turbulence of the 1960s, the urban riots, the anti-war protesters, the alienating counterculture, and embraced a new kind of conservative populism. They were sick and tired of what they interpreted as spoiled hippies. Hippies died in 1967. The Diggers in Haight-Ashbury in 1967 held the mock funeral for the hippies on October 6, 1967. And the hippies left no political doctrine at all. They were tired of interfering government that in their view, coddled poor people and black people at taxpayers' expense. And the Nixon people and strategists said that these individuals formed what was called the silent majority. And their job was to basically talk to these people or support these people who were still in Vietnam. On April 20th, Richard Nixon would announce that there would be a withdrawal of 100,000 troops from Vietnam. But 2 weeks later, the United States would invade Cambodia. And that would set up the stage for Kent State. It would extend the war, and it would seemingly preclude further withdrawals. And there he is. That's Cambodia. That's Cambodia right there. I'm pointing to Cambodia. And you see, that's right next to South Vietnam. And we have to cut off the supply lines from North Vietnam that's going through Cambodia. So we start a campaign. The campaign is in Eastern Cambodia. And the invasions were the policy of Richard Nixon with the help of the Republic of Vietnam Army. 13 major operations. They would start on April 29th. They would end on July 22nd. The U.S. forces would be involved, and the first action would start on May 1st and end on June 30th. That is Kent State. And in about 13 seconds, Kent State would change American history. This is the time that usually when I'm speaking to a crowd, that I open it up for the crowd after I lay down the foundation that leads to this burst where 9 students are shot, 4 killed, 4 wounded, and 1 permanently injured by a shot, also wounded and suffered paralysis. Before I get to Kent State, the Kent State shooting started on May 4th, 1970, occurred on May 4th, 1970. The members of the Ohio National Guard, sent there by the governor, James Rhodes, get there. There had been some disturbances on the campus the day before, March 3rd. They shoot unarmed college students during a mass protest against the bombing of Cambodia by the United States military forces. 28 guardsmen fired approximately 67 rounds of ammunition over 13 seconds, killing 4, wounding 9 others, one of whom suffered permanent paralysis. 8 soldiers would eventually face charges. All the charges would be dismissed in 1974. Some of the students who were shot had been protesting against the Cambodian campaign, which Nixon announced on television on April 30th. Other students who were shot were innocent bystanders who were just walking nearby or observing the protest. This is Marianne Vecchio, 14 years old, a runaway. Somehow ended up on the campus of Ohio State during the demonstrations, and she is screaming and pleading for help over this student, and the student at this point is dead. Anybody take part in 1970? Well, this is the question I usually ask at this point. Anybody not take their test, their finals in 1970? Anybody participating in locking down the campus? Anybody who is upset with what went on? Because I do have stories about that from other people, but I'm curious, and you could, I guess, in chat, I could see you if you want to say anything about this.
Can you unmute everybody, or do they have that option?
It's up to you as to how you want to do it, but I usually get some, I think the best is somebody does something in chat, and then we unmute them.
Okay.
If anybody has anything.
Want to type something in, folks? We can.
Because this is where normally, if I'm there with you, I normally let the audience talk. If anybody has anything to say. And if not, I'll just go on. It's up to them. Here, we got somebody. Hold on 1 second here. I lost.
I don't think we did.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't recall taking any finals. I recall the day after the shooting, there was a big protest at Griffiths Air Force Base we all went to, and basically.
Where were you, by the way? Where were you?
At Hamilton.
Oh, up in Hamilton College. Okay.
And after that, we basically didn't do much of anything for the next 2 weeks except work on our anti-war proposals that we were talking about earlier, in terms of selling treasury bills and divesting. We just actually worked on a very significant divesting campaign as well. The only thing I really remember is that I eventually realized I had to finish up my senior thesis, and spending about 24 hours a day for like a week and a half trying to get my senior thesis done. I finally turned it in about 5 minutes before the deadline. was due. My faculty advisor banging on my door asking me if I intended to graduate.
Anybody else who went to school during that time? Anybody else? Okay, we'll move on. I'm going to give you 2 stories here. And the 2 stories that I'm going to give you, one from a guy who heard this on a ship last year. I was giving a talk on a celebrity cruise ship to suite holders. And he said that he was going to school also in upstate New York, but Albany, not Hamilton at that point. And he had a best friend who was part of the New York National Guard. And he asked his friend, he said, let me ask you a question. And he said, go ahead. He said, if Nelson Rockefeller told you to shoot to kill demonstrators, would you do it? And the guy said, yes, I would. And with that, he said, this ends our friendship. I will never speak to you again. I never want to see you again. And 50 years, he never forgave that guy. There was a woman over in Roseland, New Jersey. And I was giving this talk. And she was about 75, 76 years old. And she had a young family, and she lived in Wantagh, New York. And she said that she was talking to her neighbors. They were all quite young, talking to her neighbors. And her neighbors, every one of them said to her, those National Guardsmen should have not mowed down all of them, just killed all of them. What do they think they're going to do? And with that, she moved out of Wantagh to northern New Jersey with her family because she couldn't live in that area. The demonstrations would continue. I do have people who have told me that they did shut down schools, that they didn't take their finals. It was either pass or fail, that teachers didn't even want to be there. And this starts a lot of stuff that goes on around the country. This is what would become the May 4th Coalition. And there's Marianne Vecchio. Many angry students.
Excuse me. Kathleen Walter asked, how extensive was the coverage of the students? What they had done the day before the killings. They buried a copy of the Constitution and burned the ROTC
Yeah, they
building.
burned down the yeah, they burned down. They were protesting. They were protesting. It was the ROTC building, and it was gone. I have a friend, Steve Albert, who's an announcer who went there at the time, and he came and talked about what was going on. Rhodes was a rising star in the Republican Party at that point, and he told the National Guard to do whatever you had to do. The students became angry after the shootings. The faculty members were led by a geology professor, a guy by the name of Glenn Frank, who pleaded with the students, leave the common area. After 20 minutes of speaking, the students finally left, but the wounded were still bleeding and some of them in bad shape. The guard would finally leave the area, but that was like fire going through dry grass around the country. The shootings led to protests on college campuses and in some instances in the street, like in Buffalo, New York. Student strikes, 450 campuses around the country were closed, violent and nonviolent demonstrations. This is Buffalo, New York. And there was a protest down Main Street in Buffalo, and you could see the cops in the riot gears taking on the protesters. Some of the protesters were in 11th grade, high school students, because they figured only a year and a half to go, September of 1971, before they might end up in Vietnam. So they had a combination of college kids and high school students and parents demonstrating in Buffalo. The Buffalo police were club swinging. They fired tear gas into the crowds. The protesters fired rocks into bank windows. Students were gassed. On May 7th, at Buffalo State University, the student union the police came in and broke up protesters firing tear gas and bird shot. 4 students were wounded. That is the University of New Mexico. And that's students running away from the New Mexico National Guard, and some of them were bayoneted by the guardsmen. 11 people were bayoneted by the guardsmen in New Mexico. The governor, David Cargo, called in the New Mexico National Guard. They had been given some false information by state police. They said it was false information. What they got from police wasn't exactly happening, that the protesters were armed and dangerous, and the protesters were not armed and not dangerous, but 11 people got bayoneted. And that is downtown in front of Federal Hall down in Lower Manhattan. And as an old radio guy, I love this picture for one reason. WMCA Radio. The WMCA Radio is the home of the good guys in the 1960s. They played rock and roll music. B. Mitchell Reed and Harry Harrison and Dandy Dan Daniel. But all radio stations had news departments. Ted Koppel was part of the WMCA news department at that time, believe it or not. That looks like Danny Mean to me. And this was a demonstration of the Hard Hats. It was called the Hard Hat Demonstration in Lower Manhattan, supporting the Vietnam War, supporting Richard Nixon. It was organized by a guy by the name of Peter Brennan. Peter Brennan would eventually end up in Richard Nixon's cabinet, and this is kind of getting a little dicey, and you can see there's a little children there in front as the confrontation is about ready to start. That was May 8th, 4 days after Kent State, and it was called the Hard Hat Riot. Fortunately, nothing of the nature of Kent State or Buffalo happened, but it was pro-Nixon construction workers, the kind of people that Nixon pointed out as the silent majority. And there he is. There's Richard Nixon. Early morning on Saturday. Gets up before dawn. Can't sleep. Nixon gives a news conference on May 8th. That's a Friday night. He stays up until 2:15 in the morning, 4 hours after he gives the news conference, which is very contentious at that point. I don't think my old buddy Sam Donaldson was, I did Sam Donaldson show in 2005. I was a regular. I don't think he was the White House correspondent at that time for ABC. But Nixon is taking questions. He sleeps for a couple hours. wakes up, puts on classical music, Rachmaninoff, and then looks out the window because this is Friday night and Saturday there's going to be a big anti-war protest on the mall right within his distance of the White House where he could look. So he's looking out the window and then he gets some sleep and then he hatches a plan. He's going to take his valet, a Cuban immigrant, Manolo Sanchez, down to the Lincoln Memorial. Why? Because Sanchez has never seen the Lincoln Memorial at night where all the lights are on. And Nixon figures, hey, it's a good time. The protesters are there. This is 4:30 in the morning. I have nothing better to do. Hey, Mr. Sanchez, let's go. You've always said you wanted to see the Lincoln Monument, Lincoln Memorial rather. Let's go see it filled with lights. So he hatches his plan at 4:30 in the morning. He wants Sanchez to see the monument lit up for the first time. And just maybe, Dick Nixon might be able to cross paths with some anti-war protesters so he can talk to them. So he tells the Secret Service about 4:25 in the morning, we're leaving. The Secret Service is panicking. They're not prepared for this. At 4:30 in the morning, Nixon gets into his limousine with his driver, Sanchez, and they head over to make the short trip to the Lincoln Memorial. He gets to the Lincoln Memorial, and yeah, there it is. Go see the Lincoln Memorial. Yeah, it looks good. Go see it. But Nixon has something else in mind. He wants to talk to the protesters, so he decides to talk to a small group of protesters who are waiting for the main event later that day. And Richard Nixon, I can tell you this about Richard Nixon. I dealt with him 85, 86, 87, 88, and sometimes in the social setting at a baseball game, most of the time, social setting at either a Yankees or a Mets game. And, but I first dealt with him in the official setting as he tried to settle the dispute between major league owners and the umpires. Richard Nixon was not one for small talk. Richard Nixon wasn't exactly the life of the party. He was no Rodney Dangerfield, although he got no respect. So Nixon is as awkward as can be, and he decides he's going to get involved with some small talk. To get the conversation going, I asked how old they are, what they were studying, the usual questions. Several of the students said that they were attending Syracuse University. Nixon, among things he talked about with the Syracuse students was how good the football team was. And there was one Syracuse student who was interviewed by somebody from the Washington Post who said, I hope it was because he was tired. Most of what he said was absurd. Here we had come from a university that is completely uptight on strike. And when we told him where we were from, he talked about the football team. And when somebody said he was from California, he talked about surfing. And this is what Nixon would see later on in that day. Impeach Nixon, Nixon and the Fourth Reich and the anti-war protesters. And if you see in between up toward the White House, there's a ABC news truck there, and they are shooting the demonstrators. But Nixon wasn't done after he met with the demonstrators. Meanwhile, his dialogue covered various topics: marriage, travel, race relations, air pollution. But he got around to his primary purpose, which was to explain his actions going into Cambodia. And it was all desired by his want for peace. I tried to explain in the press conference that my goals in Vietnam were the same as theirs: to stop the killing, end the war, to bring peace. Our goal was not to get into Cambodia by what we were doing, but to get out of Vietnam. They seemed to be, no, they didn't respond. I had hoped their hatred of the war, which I could understand, would not turn into a bitter hatred of the whole system, our country, and everything it stood for. I said, I know you, that most of you probably think I'm an SOB, but I want you to know I understand how you feel. That was Richard Nixon. Never had small talk for anybody, and who always seemed to be preoccupied by something else. He did know my name, which was amazing, and he's the only president I have an autograph of, Richard Nixon. Meanwhile, there was the Capitol, and after he gets done talking to the students, he decides He wants some hashed potatoes, hash browns for breakfast. So he knows that the House of Representatives cafeteria, they have these great hash browns because he was part of the House between 1947 and 1953. So he takes Sanchez with him. So the president orders the entire detail to go over to the Capitol. They walk in through the nearly deserted building, and then Nixon becomes a tour guide. And he starts pointing out, well, there's that statue, and there's this, and this is the chambers. And he walks into the chambers, and he takes his old representative seat. Remember, he was a member of Congress from, representative from California. And then he tells Manolo to go up to the speaker's platform to give a short speech. A short speech from his valet. He wants to hear it. The valet gives the speech. Then they go off to breakfast. He wanted hash browns. Couldn't get it. The diner was closed. So they went off to the Mayflower Hotel and they had breakfast. Later that day, Nixon would have people in the Oval Office. And by the way, his office down in Foley Square, across from the Southern District Court room, in the building across the street, looked just like that, except it had pictures hanging of Nixon and Sadat, and Nixon with Elvis, and Nixon with a whole bunch of people, flags all over the place. It was a miniature replica of the Oval Office, and I got to sit in that chair in the Oval Office along with Gene Orza and Arthur Shack from the Baseball Players Association, and we all did the Nixon arms in the air. I'm not a crook. And that is Haldeman, H.R. Haldeman, who's the chief of staff. And he wrote in his diary after the Lincoln Memorial visit, I'm concerned about his condition, and noted that Nixon's behavior that morning constituted the Wheeler's stay so far. And Nixon was about 16 months into his presidency at that point. We all know about Kent State, but we don't know about Jackson State. At least we don't talk about Jackson State the way we do Kent State. And there's a 50th anniversary that just passed at Jackson State. May 15th, city and state police killed 2 and wounded 12 at Jackson State College, now Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. Their crime, protesting against the Vietnam War. Overall, 900 campuses would close down. 35,000 National Guardsmen were mobilized. 21 campuses were occupied. Of this time period, Henry Kissinger, who I also met, and I'm going to tell you something about Henry Kissinger. This is what he told me. This was the days of the North American Soccer League. The biggest regret in Henry Kissinger's life, never becoming the commissioner of the North American Soccer League. He thought he could have made them last. Anyway, Kissinger said the crisis that's ongoing now for a few weeks left Nixon on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The Scranton Report, the Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton was tapped to do a report to find out why the college campuses exploded. And that would be in June of 1970, on June 13th. It would be known as the President's Commission on Campus Unrest, shortened to the Scranton Commission. And they were charged to study dissent, disorder, and violence that broke out on college campuses and universities across the nation. Many people, and some of you in here who might have gone to school at that point, probably had your option. These were the options I was told. Pass or fail. Your last few tests, drop the last test, get the average of the first few tests. You can include the last test if the average was higher, that's what you would get. Those were the two, or a letter grade. So you get pass, fail, letter grade, or an actual grade during that semester. The commissions entered finished their work in September of 1970 and concluded that the Ohio National Guard shootings on May 4th, 1970 were unjustified. It became a criminal case and was dismissed by 1974. Turned out 8 of the guards shot. The rest of them just shot up in the air. The 8 that shot were questioned and eventually would be released. That's Robert Dole. Robert Dole, who was in Congress in 1964, the Kansas senator at that point, wounded in World War II and is still alive. Robert Dole, who was in World War II, and was wounded and lost use of his arm, does something very uncharacteristic of anybody in the Senate, neither party, Democrat, Republican, going back to the Whigs. On June 24th, 1970, Dole offers an amendment to the Foreign Military Sales Act. As part of it, it's to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Senate votes 81-10 to repeal it, to get the kids out of Vietnam. July 10th, 1970, the Senate, 57-5, roll call, passed a concurrent resolution repealing the 1964 Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Twice, they had tried to repeal the 64 measure. That had never happened before in Senate history. On October 12th, Nixon would announce that 40,000 troops would come home before Christmas. November 10th, 1970, for the first time in 5 years, an entire weekends, with no reports of the United States combat fatalities in Southeast Asia. Now, while all this is going on, April 9th, the Daily Mirror, Paul McCartney quits the Beatles. The Lennon-McCartney song team splits up. Actually, the Beatles split up in September of 1969, but John Lennon was told to keep his mouth shut because Capitol Records gave the Beatles a jump in royalties. Paul leaves the Beatles. It would come back at the end of the year, not with Lennon, McCartney, and the Beatles, but something else that happened in the Oval Office. The Beatles officially split. McCartney says he's leaving the band. Actually, he never said he was leaving the band. He just wasn't working with them anymore. Let It Be would be released in May of 1970, the final Beatle released album, until the re-releases. And now this year in September, you're getting a movie and you're getting a couple of CDs all about Let It Be. So that happens in April of 1970. Apollo 13. I have a friend by the name of Dick Hull, H-O-L-L, Dick Hull. You can look him up on the internet. Dick Hull was the guy who straightened out the video that came back from the moon to the Australian tracking facility on July 20th, 1969, and it came back upside down. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, they're about ready to go on the moon. They drop their camera, it's activated, and they see everything upside down. Short, somebody forgot to flip a switch, and with about 4 seconds before the transmission goes public to 600 million people, Dick remembers, oh, gotta flip the switch. Everything was fine. But Apollo 13 goes up. Hell of a movie by Ron Howard, won some Academy Awards. Apollo 13 is going to the moon, the third lunar mission to the moon. It runs into trouble. Houston, we have a problem. Engines in the space module blew up. It was Jack Swigert who said, okay, Houston, we had a problem here. After being prompted to repeat the transmission, this is in April of 1970, Capcom Jack R. Lasmer. Lovell response, and it's the famous response, but they don't get it right. It's Houston, we had a problem. Lovell said, Houston, we've had a problem. And that was the problem. The engines blew up in the service module. They would eventually get home. Dick Hull told me that, and there are the astronauts, Tom Hanks on the left, Jack Swigert in the middle, and Fred Hayes on the right. I mean, that was Jim Lovell on the left. I'm sorry, he looks just like Tom Hanks. Fred Hayes and on the right, Swigert. Dick told me that there were about 30 options to get these guys home. And they rated them 1 through 30. And the one that got them home, the one that worked, was the 30th and least likely to work. They blasted off on April 30th, 1970, 2:13. On April 13th at 10:07, these are Eastern times, an oxygen tank explodes. 3 hours, all the oxygen was gone. Loss of water, electricity, propulsion system. They were very fortunate they had the lunar module, and they used the lunar module as a lifeboat. The crew was about 200,000 miles away from Earth. Dick said that they decided to go for broke, that they hoped that the lunar module would bring them back safely until they got rid of the lunar module and get them back into the Earth orbit. That did. There is Deke Slayton carrying a filter and showing how they took filters inside the lunar module and put them into the command module to make sure poisonous gases didn't get in. 3.5 days in the lunar module. That was designed only for 2 days, but they did make it back. And they were able to splash down eventually. They had to reorient the lunar module and get it into an orbit that they could get back. That was the most difficult hurdle. They did so. And they were able to splash down by using the lunar module. On April 17th, the crew splashed down in the Pacific Ocean near Samoa, and there's the crew. Hayes on the left, Lovell on the right, and rather in the center, and Swigert on the right side. Years later, when Ron Howard did the movie Apollo 13, Jim Lovell went on a media tour to promote the movie with Ron Howard. And the #1 question asked of Jim Lovell about Apollo 13 and about the movie wasn't about, were you scared coming home? No, no, no. That was not the #1 question. Anybody want to guess what the #1 question is? Anybody? Anybody? Anybody?
Was it about going to the bathroom in outer space?
No, it wasn't. The #1 question asked of Jim Lovell was simple. Was Tom Hanks a nice guy? That's what they wanted to know. And he said, yes, Tom Hanks was a nice guy. That was the #1 question that was asked of Jim Lovell on the tour. That is Richard Nixon, and that is King Hussein of Jordan. And King Hussein would have a lot of problems in 1970. I have a friend by the name of Robert Friedman. Perhaps in the library, in fact, I'm pretty sure in the library you probably have some of his books. He was a Middle East expert. He was an advisor to Israeli prime ministers. He was in the U.S. Air Force. He met with Arafat in Tunis. In Tunisia. And one day he's going to meet with Hussein in Amman to talk to him about peace and other initiatives. And he says that, why is this not going backwards here? Come on, we got to go
Evan, I'm not getting the slides anymore. Is anyone else experiencing?
Hold on, let's see why we're not getting the slides anymore. Let's do this on Escape. I'm not getting slides because, let me see what happened here. Let me refit the screen share. You should have the slides again. You have the slides? Hello, hello?
Yes.
Yes, they're there.
We do,
Okay.
sorry.
I don't know what happened there. Let's see. There we go. Anyway, so going back to Bob Friedman, he said that he walked into to King Hussein's office. And Bob's a teacher, still is a teacher at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And he said he walked in and there were 13 pictures on the wall. The 13 pictures on the wall were all of King Hussein's relatives, all of whom died of unnatural causes. And he often wondered if King Hussein looked up and ever thought that maybe his fate would be the 14th dying of unnatural causes. Of course, they were part of the royalty in Iraq and then fled to Jordan. There was an assassination attempt by of King Hussein of Jordan eventually during the Black September crisis, which started on September 1st, 1970. Black September, that was an offshoot of the PLO led by Yasser Arafat. And they wanted to take land in Jordan for their own. Now, King Hussein of Jordan formed a military government with Mohammed Daoud on September 15th. That was in 1970, and goes to war with Arafat's people, Black September, on September 17th, as he orders the Jordanian armed forces to get rid of the Palestinian Fedayeen from Jordan. This was one of the few times it was whatever happened in the Middle East did not center around Israel. And there is Yasser Arafat, who took over the PLO in 1969 and claimed that he had nothing to do with Black September. Black September acted as a state within the state. The Fedayeen, or the PLO, disregarded local laws, regulations. They tried to assassinate King Hussein twice, which is why I brought up the Bob Friedman stories. There were violent confrontations with them. They started in 1970 in June, but escalated on September 17th and would continue until summer of 1971. The PLO, Hussein got fed up because there were plane hijackings on September 6th that ended up in Zakar. And foreign nationals were taken as hostages, and planes were blown up in front of the international press. So Hussein decides, I've had enough at that point. This guy, Assad from Syria, who also took over in 1969. In fact, in the Middle East, in February of 69, Assad, Arafat, and Golda Meir all assumed power and heads of their state. Well, Arafat wasn't head of state, but Assad was the head of state in Syria. He decides to come in and help Arafat. September 17th, the Jordanian army surrounded cities with PLO presence, and they shelled the Fedayeen, who were in Palestinian refugee camps. On September 18th, the Syrian force, and they painted the planes with PLA markings, intervened to support the Fedayeen. They went toward Irbid. The Fedayeen said it was a liberated city, but they would withdraw after the Jordanian army launched an air-ground offensive that inflicted the Syrian Air Force with a lot of losses. Pressure started building on Hussein. On October 13th, he signed an agreement with Arafat to regulate the Fedayeen's presence, but that wasn't enough. There's the picture of Arafat on the right, Hussein on the left, signing the deal. Jordan's army attacked again in January of 71, and the Fedayeen would be driven out of Jordan. By July 17th, they would be allowed to leave for Lebanon through Syria and Assad. That is Nasser, and that is Anwar Sadat. On September 28th, Gamal Abdel Nasser passes away. He had been the president of Egypt. Anwar Sadat is named the temporary president of Egypt on October 15th. There's a vote. He gets 90.04% of the vote, and he becomes the president of Egypt. And that, of course, would eventually change Middle East history throughout the decade of the 1970s. Charles de Gaulle, in 1967, went to Expo 67 in Montreal and supported the Quebec separatists. With that, he fled Canada after the Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, who's now an airport in Toronto, said that it was uncool what de Gaulle did. On July 24th, de Gaulle, the French president, was on the balcony and said, "Vive la Quebec." And that gave the separatists a voice that they didn't have internationally. Pearson said the speech was bad, the statements were unacceptable to Canadian people. Why? Because there was a terrorist group that was going around the Montreal and Quebec area from 1963 to 1970. And it was called the Front de Liberation of Quebec. They kidnapped in 1970 the deputy premier of Quebec, Pierre Laporte, and the British diplomat James Cross. Pierre Trudeau would become involved and would invoke the War Measures Act in 1970. The kidnappers murdered Laporte. Eventually, the negotiations led to Cross's release. The kidnappers were exiled to Cuba. From 63 to 70, there were 95 bombs that were detonated. Mailboxes, the most common target, except the Montreal Stock Exchange. Remember, in those days, Montreal was the big city in terms of finance in Canada, not Toronto. There's a story behind that, because basically when the separatists were doing the push, English people moved out of Quebec and settled in Toronto and took the money with them. That bombing of February 13, 69, Stock Exchange injured 27 people. The FLQ got their money by robbing military, dynamite, industrial sites, and bank robberies. 23 of their members in jail by 1974, convicted of murder. Trudeau crushed the movement in October. And some of the things left from the separatist days is there are not erect stop signs in Quebec. They were all they should have been painted over, but they were destroyed and new signs were put up. But on federal property in Quebec, you could have the erect stop sign. Stop. The end of the crisis galvanized support against the use of violence in the efforts for Quebec's sovereignty, accelerated the movement towards election with the hope that the Quebecois who supported sovereignty would get greater autonomy and independence. There was a civil rights demonstration going on in Northern Ireland based on what was going on in the United States. Remember, by the end of 1969, you had 3 civil rights demonstrations, actually 4, going on. You had Martin Luther King's civil rights, you had women's liberation, you had the gay and lesbian movement, and you had the Indian movement and taking Alcatraz. People in Northern Ireland were looking at what was going on in America. In 1969, the British Army gets into Northern Ireland. I see we got 3 chats here. Let me take a look at them. Okay, how extensive? We lost the shared document. Thanks, Ellen. Have to run. Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Anyway, 1969, the British troops decided to go into Londonderry to put down the demonstration as the Catholics and the Protestants were going at it. They were only supposed to stay there for a couple of days, and they stayed there until 1998 when George Mitchell, the former Senate Majority Leader, the Democrat from Maine, worked out a resolution between the Catholics and the Protestants. Now, women's liberation, I mentioned that there was a women's strike, or at least an attempt at a women's strike, August 26th of 1970, a march down Fifth Avenue from 59th Street to 42nd Street, rally at Bryant Park. The women's strike for equality takes place on the 50th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment, which gave women, most American women, the right to vote. There were some American women who did not get the right, still had to fight for it. That's Betty Friedan, one of the organizers of that movement. There were 3 goals: free abortion on demand, equal opportunity in the workforce, free childcare. Those were the 3 primary demands of the National Organization of Women in 1970. And I've had women who were part of protests in the late 60s, early 70s said, we're still fighting for some of that stuff. In 1968, women's liberation got on the front page of newspapers with the Burn Your Bra movement, and Burn Your Bra at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City. In 1970, at the Miss World pageant in London, the show hosted by Bob Hope at the Royal Albert Hall, it was disrupted by the women's liberation movement. 50 women hurled smoke bombs, stink bombs, and ink bombs. Why? Because they thought women in the pageant did not represent most women. It has William Safire. William Safire, who ended up being the columnist of the New York Times. He and Patrick Buchanan were Nixon's speechwriters. And he was the guy who put the words into Spiro Agnew's mouth, talking about how the media was the enemy. September 11th, 1970. I'll do this radio style. In the United States, we have more than our share of the nathering nabobs of negativism. Agnew criticized his opponents and the press. The words written by William Safire, who went on to be a media member, editorial board member of the New York Times, who put those words into Spiro Agnew's mouth. The last major ever rock concerts on the Woodstock level, on the Monterey Pop level, was in the Isle of Wight, August 26, 1970, 600,000 attend. Jimi Hendrix, The Who, Chicago, Richie Havens, who I dealt with, who had the longest fingernails I ever saw on a man because he was picking his guitar, as he explained to me. John Sebastian Joan Baez, who just did her 50th, her retirement tour, rather. 10 years later, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, the Moody Blues, Jethro Tull, so many acts there. 1970 was a tough year for rock and roll because a number of people passed away. Janis Joplin, heroin overdose. Jimi Hendrix, choked on drug-induced vomit. Sesame Street is in its first full year, but there were some people who did not like Sesame Street, particularly in Mississippi. Now, Mississippi is a strange media market because you get your PBS out of New Orleans, you get it out of Mobile, Alabama, you get it out of Memphis. There are very few TV stations actually in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi. But a state commission in 1970 voted to ban Sesame Street to try to kick it off of PBS in Mississippi, and that's very little. You know, Memphis is the big market, Mobile is the bigger market, New Orleans is the bigger market. And they said that they did not like that show being shown in Mississippi because of its highly integrated cast of children. That is Sorley's, McSorley's, the old ale house, the oldest Irish tavern in New York City, founded in 1854. Women's liberation groups went after them. I don't know why. The place stunk. It had sawdust on the floor, but they didn't allow women in there. The National Organization of Women sued them for discrimination. Instead of fighting them, they said, you know what, you want to come in here? The place stinks. There's sawdust on the floor. It's not that appetizing, but if you want to come in here, you're welcome. And they did. And McSorley's becomes one of the last taverns to allow women into them in New York City. That's the Chicago Seven. The Chicago Seven, February of 1970. All of the defendants are acquitted of conspiracy. 5 of them are convicted of inciting a riot, each sentenced to 5 years in prison, given $5,000 of fines. All of them would have the verdict overturned on appeal. Monday Night Football. There's my old friend Howard Cosell. Howard's grandson Justin comes to some of my talks up in Stamford, Connecticut. Keith Jackson and the Dandaroo, Don Meredith. Monday Night Football makes its debut September of 1970. New York Jets, Cleveland Browns. Keith Jackson, who I knew, said the best thing that ever happened to him was leaving Monday Night Football, or he might have died a lot earlier because he couldn't keep up with Howard and he couldn't keep up with Dandy Don. That is Jim Bouton and me. That's the Yogi Berra Museum. Jim Bouton, I'm sure you have this book in your library, Ellen, Ball 4, probably the best baseball or sports book ever written. Humanized players, talked about how players did some things like drink, and they didn't drink milkshakes per se. Jim passed away last year. We had a nice friendship. This is the only time that we appeared together speaking was at Yogi Berra's Museum in 2007. Ball 4, the baseball commissioner, Bowie Kuhn, calls Jim Bouton into his office June of 1970 and says, now just tell everybody that you made all the stories up and everything will be fine. And he says, no, none of the stories were made up. And Jim Bouton was kind of the guy who opened the door or pulled the curtain from the window to see that baseball players were really human after all. It was published on June 14th.
Evan?
Yes.
I've got a little personal connection. I grew up in a modest neighborhood in Ridgewood, and a lot of the Yankee ball players would rent a house down the street.
Including Jim.
One of them. And the commissioner, I graduated high school with one of his sons.
Oh, Bowie Kuhn. Bowie Kuhn. So as we wrap up here, a couple of things tying up the year. March 1st, Rhodesia severs its ties with British Crown, declares itself a racially segregated republic. Tonga on June 4th, Fiji October 10th also gained independence from Britain. That is Allende. Salvador Guillermo Allende Husins was a Chilean democratic socialist politician, physician. He was the president of Chile from 1970 through 73, head of the Popular Unity political coalition government, and he was the first Marxist ever to be elected president of a democracy. That is Pope Paul VI. There was an assassination attempt November 27th of 70. He's wounded in the chest during a visit to the Philippines by a dagger-wielding Bolivian painter disguised as a priest. Now, if you ask the Richard Nixon Library, which is in California, ask them what the most requested picture is of Nixon's presidential career, which went from January 20th, 1969 to August 6th, 1974. Vice President, of course, Congress, of course. But you ask them, what is the most requested picture? And it's that one. The king of rock and roll meets me, Richard Nixon. Very odd that Elvis Presley and Richard Nixon would want to meet each other, but they did. It was December 21st, the first day of winter. Maybe there's some symbolism in there, I don't know. Elvis Presley meets Richard Nixon in the White House. Elvis had been trying to get into the White House for a while. He wanted to talk to Nixon because he wanted to become, as we used to know these people back in the 70s, a narc. Elvis wanted to get a badge from the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. His wife, Priscilla, later wrote that with a badge, he thought he could illegally enter any country both wearing his guns and carrying any drugs he wished. Elvis never left the United States. Well, in 1957, he did a show in Toronto, and of course, he went to the army in Germany, but he never left the United States, partly because his manager, the Colonel Tom Parker, was an illegal. He was from Denmark. And the Colonel felt that, and he went everywhere with Elvis, they had a 50-50 split, and he felt if he left the country, they'd figure that he was an illegal and he'd never get back in the country. And Elvis listened to everything that the Colonel did professionally. So he never gave a concert outside of the United States other than those concerts in Toronto. He did go to Hawaii once, but that was safe territory for the Colonel. So Elvis does meet with the king of rock and with Richard Nixon. Elvis is all smiles there. Now look at Dick. I don't know if Dick gave any personality or not, but they seem to hit it off. They seem to have a good time together. Nixon got a letter from Elvis. I can and will do more good if I were made a federal agent at large, and I will help out. I will help out by doing it my way. He wasn't singing My Way yet in Las Vegas. That was Sinatra. But I'll do it my way. Through my communications with people of all ages. The problem was Elvis's fans never grew after he went into the army, and the only fans he had were the fans who loved those cheesy movies that he made. My favorite movie has Elvis owing the IRS money, and he and Bill Bixby break into a song in an IRS movie. He's not your uncle, he's the tax man or something like that. He concluded by saying he would love to meet the president, and his target were these guys. So these guys had broken up a year and a half earlier. John Lennon, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and Ringo Starr. Apparently the two men got along well during their meeting, and Presley got his badge. During the meeting, Presley said that he felt the Beatles exemplified an anti-American nature. They were from Liverpool, England. They were not Americans. The Beatles broke up in September of 1969. This meeting took place in December of 1970. Hey, maybe Elvis was in the time warp. And if he was, on New Year's Eve of 1970, he would be reminded that the Beatles really did break up because Paul McCartney sues Alan Klein and the other three Beatles to undo the partnership. And that's the year that was. It's over. We got to let it go. In 1971, Nixon would move on to other things like getting his tape recorder. And there would be the Pentagon Papers in 1971. The war would continue in 1971. And Nixon would be facing some other problems. Thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, and oh, by the way, that's me in 1979 when I took my card when I had my picture taken for my Secret Service card, which allowed me to cover the 1980 presidential election. And there was a lot of Richard Nixon on the campaign trail in 1980, even though he was on ice, so to speak. You know, out exiled. You haven't even talked to David Frost yet, but Nixon was in exile at that point. Anyway, Ellen, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm
Glen
just double
Rock
checking.
Library. And anybody have anything to say?
I see a raised hand, but I can't tell.
You can open up all the mics now.
Okay, from Kathy Smolin. What's up, Kathy? Feel free to talk, Kathy.
All right, this is Paul.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
It was you had mentioned earlier, you know, about the protests at the time. We were both in Washington in '69 for the big protest down there.
The moratorium, November 15th.
The big protest.
Yeah, the 2 million people. Did you see anybody you know down there?
We went down. We were both at school at the time. We went down on buses that the school that the student organization had chartered. So there were a whole group down there. I still remember being gassed on Dupont Circle.
You were gassed, tear gassed.
Yeah, tear gassed on Dupont Circle. It's a memory that doesn't fade fast.
I've never been tear gassed. I got this question, being the reporter that I am. I've never been tear gassed. What is that like?
Basically, I was fortunately not in the middle of it, but your eyes just, you know, it's like somebody just peeled a giant onion under your nose, and your eyes just start closing down, and your nose and everything else. It just kind of, there's a real reaction to it.
And how long does that last?
Until you get away from it and get some fresh air. Fortunately, if you run pretty quick, which I did at the time, it didn't last too long.
Anybody else? Do we have anybody else there who wants to say something?
If you want to say something before we sign off, just you can unmute yourselves. While we're waiting, I do want to thank again Evan for presenting us with all of these great photos and great information, and thank our friends at the library for sponsoring our program today. We're going to be offering more of these virtual programs, so if you've not signed up for our weekly newsletter, just email me from our website, and I will make sure you get on the list. So thank you again, everybody. I don't think I see any other questions. So I'm going to say thank you again, Evan. Be well, everyone. Stay safe and healthy out there, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you to everyone who was here today, and hopefully we'll see you somewhere down the road.
Okay, you were so welcome. Take care now.
Okay, bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.